Okay, so we've been starting to talk about reasons why people don't think critically all that much. And the biggest reason that we've talked about so far was relativism. It's true for you, but not for me, which is an easy way to give up. We dispatched that philosophy by showing that absolute relativism is self-contradictory. Okay, one down. We've also described critical thinking yet one more time as the anti-dogmatism doctrine and talked about the difference between epistemology and ontology, saying that critical thinking correct ontology, correct knowledge about the world is the end goal, but the process of how we get to that is what we spend most of our time and effort focusing on. And the process of how we get to true knowledge is epistemology. The stuff about Karl Popper, that's a little vague. Especially if you've never heard of the guy before. We tried to talk about open versus closed societies, and the most succinct description of their differences would probably be that closed societies focus right on the end product of correct ontologies. Correct views, correct action, everyone being correct. And how we get to the correct answers is just a means to an end. Whereas the defining feature of an open society is a flip of that hierarchy. A focal emphasis on the process by which we try to get our answers. Yeah, we still want correct answers, correct ontologies, but the process of getting knowledge, the epistemology, is what takes center stage. Critical thinking is a focus on epistemology. And not everyone has that focus. The alternatives to critical thinking tend to focus on ontology, what we know, to the neglect of the process. One type of pitfall that limits critical thinking is egocentrism. It's right because I said it. Or it's cultural abstraction, ethnocentrism, or sociocentrism. It's right because it's what my country or culture does. That works until you notice someone else in another country or another culture saying the same thing. But their conclusion about what is right is not the same thing as your conclusion about what is right. But they're giving the same reason. Not working. Or when you say it's right because I said it and I'm an intelligent, rational person. And then someone else says something else is right because he said it and he's a rational, intelligent person. Egocentrism and ethnocentrism tend to run into mirror image roadblocks like that, where someone else can give the same reason for a different conclusion. So they're logically weak. Reasons why they exist are there. Sometimes they're even good reasons, and we'll get to that. So, reasoning poorly, as opposed to reasoning well, the goal of critical thinking, is usually a matter of self-deception. Having false beliefs. Well, what's a belief anyway? Important word, and I didn't define it yet. Make people define their terms. If nothing else, it's a good check that they know what they're talking about, that they know what it means. Sometimes people just sort of start talking and don't really know, and they're just spouting out words. And then if you're trying to follow those words, good luck. So what is a belief anyway? It's an investment of confidence or trust. I think something's true, and I'm invested emotionally in it, and maybe even financially. I've made other decisions based on the idea that something's true. I've made other actions and decisions based on that piece of info. So if that piece of info turns out to be false, there could be bad consequences. Like financial investments, investments of trust beliefs often suffer from sunk cost fallacies. That, I've put so much work into it already, I can't abandon it now. I'm so invested in it, I'd look like a fool if I walked away. However, technically, if it's not going to work, it's not going to work if you stay with it, and it's not going to work if you abandon it. Either way, it's still not going to work. So, either way, the amount of energy and time you've wasted on it already is already lost. That sunk cost is on both branches of the decision tree. So if you're making decision trees and really looking with cold rationality, sunk cost reasoning is bad. Don't do it. However, that's a lot easier said than done. A lot of people, a lot of the time, do sunk cost reasoning. It's most obvious with financial investments or big projects, but it happens all the time with investments of trust, beliefs. Whenever we keep thinking something, even after evidence is shown that, maybe that's not true. So, in our explanation of why people don't think critically a lot, we're basically diving into a tour of self-deception. So if it's bad, why do people do it? First, they might not know that they're doing it. How you deal with new information and change your beliefs is largely predicted by what beliefs you already have, how you filter that information. And yes, we always need to filter, because we have limited observation, memory, and attention resources. We can't pay attention to everything. Everything is just too big. We live in the information age. And everything is always going to be too big. Even back in caveman days, if you're just a caveman out in a field, you might be trying to hunt a bird, but you can't pay attention to the motions of every single bird in the field and every single blade of grass and everything around you. That's just too many things. Human brains don't have that much working memory and attention. Some are better than others. Some are better at multitasking, some have bigger, more working memory slots, better short-term memory. Some are better than others. Mine's particularly bad, but even for people who are good at that kind of thing, their working memory is not infinite. But the world sort of is. So we have to filter information, ignoring a lot of stuff. Some of it we ignore intentionally, but a real lot gets ignored even before it comes to our conscious mind. If stuff didn't get filtered out before it reaches the thinking awareness part of your mind, life would be very distracting and overwhelming. So our preconceptions and our old beliefs tend to filter what we notice and how we react to new information. That's efficient. It's necessary. It doesn't always produce good results, though. And so we try to be more observant. Open-mindedness and active listening help. They're not perfect solutions, but they do help. Earlier, I pointed out egocentrism and ethnocentrism as bad things that limit critical thinking. One question you generally should ask whenever someone says, this is a bad thing, is, if it's so bad, then why is it still around? Take a Darwinian perspective. If it was so obviously, egregiously flawed, it should have went extinct a long time ago. Or be something that people notice in 1 second is stupid, and so stop doing it. So if people haven't stopped doing it, or if people who do it aren't all dead, there must be some upsides to it, or else it probably would have went extinct a long time ago. So, upsides to egocentrism: it's right because I said it, and I'm an authority. Or ethnocentrism: well, that's the way my society does it, and my society's awesome. Everyone should do it that way. There are some upsides to those. And they're related to the reasons that closed societies exist. Previously, we spent a lot of time trying not to be one-sided about open societies versus closed societies. Obviously, super critical thinkers tend to come from open societies. You see where Popper and the open society were pointing. But really, there are two options. A good critical thinker would explore the other one too. And considering that closed societies do exist, their vices must have some benefits. Or else the closed societies would have gone extinct and everyone would be open societies. Which isn't the case. So, upsides of egocentrism: self-confidence. Operating in a complete lack of confidence, you get analysis paralysis. Well, I think this, but I'm usually wrong, so, wow, I need to do a real lot of thinking to reorient myself. And that can be fun from a philosophical perspective. Like Chuang-Tzu's butterfly dream. How do I know I'm not a butterfly? I was dreaming. I know I was dreaming at some point. And I was a butterfly, and I'm a human. How do I really know that right now I'm not a dream character, and that I'm not really a butterfly that fell asleep, and if dreaming, it's a person who's teaching a course on critical thinking? Do I really know that that last night I was a human dreaming I was a butterfly, and not the other way around? Descartes in 17th century France did something like that in his writings, and at least in the West, he's more famous than Chuang's butterfly dream. Descartes' demon, a little darker than the butterfly, but same thing. We have that type of philosophy in both cultures. But if you went through daily life with that extremely high level of skepticism, am I gonna wake up and be a butterfly in 2 minutes? How do I know? Do I really know? That would probably be very paralyzing. You'd be hedging your bets a real lot, and you'd probably be much less productive and successful in life than if you omit all that critical thinking, because technically we don't know that reality isn't all a dream. We don't technically know, but we navigate the simulation a lot better if we go around behaving as if it's not a simulation and that we're really people and not butterflies. So, too much doubt and skepticism can be paralytic and can fracture a society. So, ethnocentrism, also called in-group bias, or the herd instinct, or loyalty. Wait a minute, loyalty's that's a good word. Societies that cohere together and people work as a team, rather than, I'm not gonna help you, for all I know you're a figment of my imagination. Maybe you're a butterfly too. A society that worked like that wouldn't work together very well. And society has some benefits. Electricity, phones. A wild man in isolation couldn't invent that himself. So, for the basic self-confidence that's necessary to make any decisions and not be paralyzed by the breadth of the necessary analysis, and for the teamwork that social cohesion undergirds, there are a lot of good reasons to limit critical thinking and operate as a rather closed society. So these vices and impediments to critical thinking keep existing, even though we've labeled them as bad things. Anytime a bad thing keeps living, there might be some reason for that. It might have some redeeming virtues. But generally we say, don't be a bigot, don't be ethnocentric, don't be prejudiced, don't judge people all by stereotypes, don't have a partisan mindset, don't scapegoat. From a don't be too egocentric or ethnocentric perspective. But wow, that was a lot of words, a lot of things that still exist even though they're bad. Why might those still exist? Well, basically critical thinking is a luxury. It's something we do when we have time, data, people to talk to, and use their time and data to stand on the shoulders of giants and advance knowledge. But in some situations, we don't have those luxuries of other people, time, and information. If we just don't have time, then quick, linear, unself-reflective, uncritical thinking, sometimes that's the best option. Or if we don't have any good first-hand information, sometimes operating according to stereotypes is the best that we can do. A stereotype wouldn't have gotten invented in the first place if it wasn't true at least more than half the time. We say that that credulously accepting stereotypes is bad because stereotypes are not always correct. They might be wrong 49% of the time. Ideally, we have enough time and resources and information to actually do real research, see if that stereotype applies to the individual, and judge the individual on their actual features and merits, not just on the general group stereotype. But what if we actually have no time or no information? I bet on the thing that's right 51% of the time, not on the thing that's right only 49%. So when you have no time or no information at all, sometimes making your decisions based on stereotypes is the best you can do. And sometimes self-deception in longer time horizon, more complex issues, yeah, it's bad, don't do it. Or at least try not to. But there are extreme immediate examples where self-deception might be useful. Like, let's say, like, there was an anecdote of someone in a car crash, and they said that during the actual seconds of the crash, they were sort of just driving normally, still trying to steer as best they could, almost like they were in denial of the fact that there was a good chance that they were going to get killed or at least severely injured and be in a lot of pain and bad things are happening. And that self-deception of the gravity of the situation helped keep the person's mind clear that they were able to sort of steer the car and crash it as safely as possible. Which is a lot better than just, complete freak out, nothing, which would probably be appropriate for the gravity of the situation, but in a complete freak out where you don't really take any action at all, the crash would have been a lot worse. Granted, that's an anecdote, but sometimes things like that do happen. That's an example of one time where self-deception and denial over the course of a few seconds in a very simple, straightforward car crash issue is indeed adaptive and a good thing, not a bad thing. However, the problem we have is that most human instincts and tendencies are fit for the world of cavemen, where most problems are physical, immediate, and will result in a very quick resolution. We don't have so many of those in modern life. Modern life is usually relatively safe. Car crashes are one exception. But as far as not getting eaten by that lion that's watching you watch the birds that you're hunting. Dodging the lion is probably a lot like a car crash. And those car crash-like running away from a predator scenarios were a much larger fraction of the types of problems that our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago faced. Very recently in human history, the world changed. We got civilization and computers and internet, and we're a lot better and safer with electricity and houses. But that's very recent in evolutionary terms. So our natural tendencies are still geared for the running away from a lion type of problems. And so now our instincts have this horrible mismatch with the long-term complex, don't be in denial, but rather get help with your math homework kinds of problems that we face. Culture lag, or evolutionary lag, is what you would call it. And maybe eventually our instincts will catch up with the types of problems that we face. Honestly, I think it's unlikely. Natural selection only works if you have a selective pressure, and it works over very long timescales. Whereas the changes in culture and current situations are very quick. I'm not sure that biology is ever going to catch up. Maybe if we do some great gene editing, maybe. But that would not be natural selection. That would be something else. Maybe something good, but it would be something else. And because of that mismatch between our evolutionarily ingrained tendencies and the types of problems that we tend to face in modern civilized society, we need to apply the extra force of intentional thought. We have to actually study and willfully apply critical thinking. Because only recently in history did living by critical thinking become adaptive and not just really slow and paralytic. And a lot of behavior and instinct just hasn't caught up to that changed reality yet. Okay. So earlier when we were debating the virtues and vices of uncritical thinking, we pointed out that uncritical thinking, no reasoning backwards, but just going straight ahead, tends to produce quicker action. Not necessarily less error-prone action, but quicker. So we have a trade-off. Slow but sure, quick but error-prone. What are those two different strategies operating within? Where do they become different? They operate in the field of assumptions. How many assumptions does one make? And does one probe and question their assumptions? Well, another big word. Stop him. Stop him before he goes any further with that new word he hasn't defined. What's an assumption? It's just any proposition, probably a premise, that the person makes without establishing it. They just sort of throw it out there, and they don't have other premises that back it up. They don't argue for why something's true, they just sort of say it. Don't make assumptions. It makes an ass out of you and me. ASSUME. Yeah, that's cute, but if we don't make any assumptions, we get into an infinite regress problem. We take one statement, justify it with a bunch of premises and an argument. Ooh, each of those premises are an assumption. Justify each of them with individual more arguments. Oh, their premises are assumptions. And you just have to go on forever, back to the beginning of the universe, and possibly before that. Impractical. So we have to make assumptions. The danger is when we forget that something is just an assumption. It could be wrong, we don't really know, we haven't proven it. When we forget that something is an assumption and don't admit the possibility that it's wrong. When we forget that an assumption is an assumption is when reasoning can go awry. So don't so much beware of assumptions. Rather, be aware of assumptions. You have to make them, and you have to start somewhere. So it looks like in critical thinking, uncovering that a proposition is just an assumption, and then examining, testing, checking the truth and reliability of that assumption is a lot of what we do in critical thinking. So we're probing assumptions. What would we do? What do we look for in an assumption? Well, two things we look for are syllogisms and relevance. Syllogism is the connections between claims. Like if I say that all A's are B's and all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, I'm making connections between these statements. What I literally did was substitute letters. I substituted B for A in the second sentence. And that substitution's valid. But what if I scramble the letters? All A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's. Sounds similar, but no, that one doesn't work. You can find counterexamples if you put the right real-world nouns in the place of the letters. So some syllogisms always work, some don't. And a lot of what professional logicians do is figure out which ones work and which ones don't. We're not going to do that because it's long and hard and we have lives. And luckily, other people in history have done it. The ancients and the medieval scholars, they spend all their time doing that, so we don't have to. So some syllogisms are good, and you gotta check and make sure that the person making the argument didn't accidentally or intentionally use a bad syllogism. And relevance also matters. Like, let's say someone said, we shouldn't rely on computers so much. And I say, why? And they say, well, because computers are made by humans. that argument, it's not great. But let's compare it to another possible argument. We shouldn't rely so much on computers. Why not? Because cars are made by humans. What do cars have to do with whether humans should rely on computers? The cars' justification is irrelevant. And luckily that was an obvious example, but a lot of times the relevance of a premise is debatable. Sometimes an irrelevant premise is a lot harder to catch. So you've got to look for, check the relevance of the premises that lead to the conclusion or assumption, and check the logical connections between them. Check the syllogisms that say that the premises add up to the conclusion. An argument is solid, it's sound, if both the premises are true in fact, and if the connections between them are valid. And that's a mouthful, but we're going to repeat that a lot throughout this book, so relax. Let's end with an example of well-used assumptions. This is if you miss this, just look up the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and it has all this there. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Yeah, there were some people who actually wrote like that back in the 18th century. English has gotten a bit easier since then. But after his giant first sentence, Thomas Jefferson goes on to say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And then he goes on to argue that, therefore, George III should not be King of America. Jefferson's nice in that he clearly says what his assumptions are. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I'm not even going to argue for them. I say they evidence themselves. He's clear about the lift of what they are, and he's clear about the fact that they are assumptions. That is an intellectually courteous way to go about things. Of course, Jefferson's lines also, we won't get to really rhetoric until the end of the book, but there's some pretty good rhetoric there. Why is he so clear about his assumptions? Because technically an assumption is just an assumption. It might be false. Maybe one of his assumptions is wrong, and then his whole argument falls apart. Why would he make his assumptions obvious so that someone who doesn't like him could easily attack his assumptions? Well, he happened to know that pretty much anyone who would be reading it, whether in America or Britain, agreed with those assumptions. So if the king argued that one of those assumptions is false, the king would look like a jerk in the opinions of mankind. So he was actually sort of laying a trap by being so forthright with labeling his assumptions. So being intellectually honest and a good critical thinker, laying his assumptions out to scrutiny, and being tricky at the same time. Sort of cute. He was an interesting writer, as you probably guessed from that paragraph-length first sentence. Okay. Now, let's